And we're broadcasting live again from beautiful downtown Oakland, California, where every day is a holiday and every night is a gunfight or something. So tonight we are going to be talking about the mythology of the work. And I say mythology because last week we talked about history. History is the stuff that can be written down. The stuff that can be corroborated through other people's accounts. And for tonight, we have to go somewhat into prehistory and into stories. Now, that doesn't mean that there might not be some truth to this. We know that a lot of material has come down almost unchanged from thousands of years ago. Gurdjieff's father could recite the story of Gilgamesh so closely to what we found on the tablets that he might as well have been reading off of one. And the Ashags of Turkey are famous for that, as are the various storytellers from other cultures around this part of the world. So while this is going to be mythology, there is going to be some truth to it somewhere in there. There's always a grain of truth here or there. So we have to go back a very, very long way for this. Probably 6,000 years thereabouts, to Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. Civilization is maybe not such a good thing, but it happened anyway, so we're stuck with it. Mr. Gurdjieff talks about an idea called the catastrophe not according to law. And this was the time, according to him, where humanity split up into two separate streams. The greater of which basically became mechanical, and as he said, could only live more or less comfortably as masters and slaves. And then the smaller stream is the what he called the conscious circle of humanity. And so we're going to talk about some of the mythology of the conscious circle of humanity tonight. And in order to do that, we have to go all the way back to Sumer. And as you know, or as you may know, Mr. Gurdjieff and Mr. Ouspensky both put the origin of their teachings in Sumer. And so tonight you're going to learn to speak a little Sumerian. You're going to learn some interesting concepts. And the interesting thing about Sumer and the Sumerians is what they did 6,000 years ago, we still use today. A lot of our numbering systems, like a dozen, comes out of Sumer. The 360 degrees of a circle come out of Sumer. The 60 minutes in an hour, the 60 seconds in a minute, the 12 hours of the day and 12 hours of the night can be traced back to there. Lots of stuff goes back to Sumerian origins, even though they had one of the weirdest mathematical systems ever. It's called a sexagesimal system, and that means it's a base 60 system, but not just base 60. It was a 10 times 6 system. So you would create numbers 1 through 9 with strokes in 10 all the way up to 60, and then you would start over again. They also used a base 10 system. And they made a distinction between the 6 and the 10. The number 6 was for things spiritual, and the number 10 was for things practical. And so the 6 and the 60 you found in religious texts, and then you found the 10 in business stuff. And we know this because there are tons and tons and tons of tablets that come out of the Middle East that have all of this cuneiform on it that are like laundry lists and grocery lists. The Sumerians basically wrote down everything. And it makes sense because they had a lot of clay. You know, between the Tigris and the Euphrates River, the one thing that you have is clay. And so we have probably millions of tablets from back then. Sumerians also had 2 languages. They had what we usually call the men's language and the women's language. In Sumerian, the men's language is called Emegir, which means the language of the knife. And the women's language was Emesal. And you use the men's language, again, for everyday transactions in the marketplace. And you use the women's language for religious materials and poetry and things like that, which makes translating Sumerian incredibly weird. Because if you mistake which language is which, you end up with a really wacky translation. And I have experimented with this. I translated a poem called The Descent of Inanna. And the thing about it was that unless Inanna or her sister Erishkigal were speaking, everybody was speaking in men's language, and the 2 religious figures were speaking in women's language. So you had to know when to translate what as what. Great fun. But back to the idea of question here. Are there things written to be translated in either version?
Ask Aaron. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hang on for a second.
I sneezed.
There you go.
Yeah, Vivian asked if we could spell out the name of the Sumerian women's and men's languages.
I just did.
Yeah, I'm just saying for the audio. And so we'll make sure that that gets posted in the so that people can see that as well. Thank you, Vivian.
So now, before we go any further, I want to talk about the theory of the hidden masters. Now, there are 2 theories, what I call the strong theory and the weak theory. The strong theory of the hidden masters is that there are these secret, all-powerful beings that are hidden away somewhere, and they control everything, and they guide the destinies of men and all of that kind of stuff. That's the strong theory. You find that in like the Theosophical Society and a lot of Victorian writings. You know, the Blavatsky and all of her gang were really into that, and all of the I Am movement now, where you're channeling the ascended masters and all of this kind of stuff. And then we have the weak theory. The weak theory says that there are human beings that are that have done lots and lots of work on themselves and have woken up, and that they are not all powerful, but they work to preserve and pass on the teachings of the work so that others can free themselves from the bonds of slavery and become awake adult human beings. That's the weak theory of the Ascended Masters. They know a lot. They are not all powerful. They are not controlling the world. They are merely the custodians of a particular teaching that has maybe been handed down since antiquity. I personally think that the weak theory is the more accurate one. I've noticed that with the strong theory, that the Ascended Masters who get channeled through all of these people never seem to know more than the people themselves who are doing the channeling. So that's always a test for me. Now, why do we look at this period of time as the starting point? It's because this is when the catastrophe happened. Before the first civilizations in Sumer and the surrounding areas, humanity was organized very, very differently. There were no cities. This was when agriculture first came around. Agriculture did some interesting things, not the least of which is it tied human beings to a spot on the ground. Before then, people were basically nomadic. They were hunter-gatherers, occasionally herdsmen for the more advanced, but there was no stationary civilization, and there was no need for things like slaves or war or any of that kind of stuff. In hunter-gatherer times, when two groups of humans encroached upon each other, they would just walk off in different directions most of the time, unless they sat down and had a party. It was not a time of conflict. We get into major conflicts when all of a sudden you are holding a piece of land and creating a surplus off of it, and other people see that and they want it, so they try and take it from you. This is also where you get into the idea of kings. Probably no worse thing has ever happened to humanity than the idea of kings. And when I say kings, I also mean queens. This idea of a ruler that must be obeyed. And this was not an idea that existed, as far as we can tell, before the development of the agricultural revolution and before the development of city-states. And as everybody here has heard me before, this is the point where human beings become neotenous, where we end up, how would you say, never ever growing up, never reaching adulthood, staying children our entire lives, which makes it much, much easier to give over control to some sort of alpha male, usually a male. So we have that going for us right at this period, this transition from wild free range human beings to basically domesticated humans, primates that are kept in domestication their entire lives and end up working a plot of land incessantly for somebody else's benefit. Now, hunter-gatherers, as a rule, work 2 to 4 hours a day. Farmers work 12 hours a day. It's an interesting trade-off. which is not to say that there haven't been some good things coming out of civilization, but you got the bad with the good. So, right at this junction, when human beings were not entirely domesticated yet, we have stories of what are now referred to as the gods of Sumer. You know, so you have Enki and Inanna and all of these different deities, one for each city usually. And my take on it is they were not gods. They were people, and they were highly advanced members of a priestly caste, which were probably part of the awakened circle of humanity. And into this, we have some stories. One of the most salient stories is Inanna's receiving the May from Enki. So a May is spelled M-E, pronounced M-A-Y. A May is an interesting thing because it is an idea complex. And not just instructions or idea, but something that if you went to a temple and you received a May, you might receive the May of beer brewing, because beer brewing was really, really important in ancient Sumer. You would have the skills of beer brewing imprinted on you rather than just reading a set of instructions. You would leave the temple being a master brewer. And you would produce beer that was clean to drink because the alcohol would have killed off all the bugs and protected you from infection. And you're going to, how did it do that? It's simple. The beer that the Sumerians brewed contained natural tetracycline. So they were basically drinking antibiotics. Kind of a weird sort of thing. So a May is a set of instructions that are imprinted rather than just delivered. You don't learn them, you become them. And some May are better than others. Every temple had its own May. And there was one kind of May called May Ni Galam, which means perfect May or perfected May. And these were like the highest level of the May. And the ones, there's this whole story about how Inanna, who is the lady of Uruk, goes to Enki, who is like Enki is a little bit of a trickster god. I forget what city he belonged to. But she goes there and she tricks him into giving her 30 May that are all perfected May. And she takes them back to her own city for the use of her people. And one of the May that were contained in this group was the May of how to create more May, how to do meta programming of May. So you have a process, you take it, and you use your knowledge of how to make May to turn that process into a May that can then be distributed to other people. This was incredibly important to the time. So, according to the tradition, let me scroll my notes here. I have all of this stuff written out. According to the tradition, this is where the Enneagram originates. The Enneagram is one of the May that Inanna received from Enki and took to her city, and then was distributed. Now, the idea behind this, I've got to give you a couple of more weird Sumerian words. So the first word is dub, D-U-B, which means to move or moving. Second word is si, which means completely still, unmoving. And then the third word is shita. And that literally you can translate it as marriage. And so there's this thing in Sumerian referred to as the Dubsishita, which is the Proto-Enneagram. It means the moving marries the still. And it was considered what's called a namshub. Namshub means, nam means sign, and shub means to cast. So to cast a sign. It is a dynamic thing, not like a spell, but it is something that had the ability to act on the world. And supposedly, the Enneagram was created at this point. Now I have to introduce you to another weird name, and it's a mouthful. It's Eme Ubshukna Sharmuna. Ime Ub Shu Ukin Na Sharmuna. For you, Kyle, anytime you have that little V over the S, it's pronounced as a hard SH, like sh as in should. Now,
Ahmed has an interesting question.
Okay, let me.
He asks, is this related to the law of three, affirming, denying, reconciling?
Yes. Very good. Yep. And it's also related to the law of seven. The law of three and the law of seven interact here. So, according to the ancient myths and traditions, there was this group that formed in the city of Uruk, around Inanna and her temple. And it was a group of priests, scientists, magicians, which were kind of the same thing at the time. And I should note here that though I tend to use the masculine pronoun as is usual in the English language when talking about groups, it is very important to understand that this group was made up equally of women and men, and it was run originally and frequently by women. So the words that I just gave you, it is the assembly of those who sing the May of completing humans. That's what that name means. So when Inanna brought the tablets or the May back from Eridu, which was Enki's city, to her city, a group of people began forming around her who would come to her temple in order to study the May. There was one rule for who was admitted, and they had to be what was called Mugasham, Mugasham, Mugasham. And that means the master of the word, somebody who had a particular level of linguistic sophistication, somebody whose ability to abstract language was at a much higher level than that of the normal person. And Kailas is beginning to become Mugasham right now. She's learning the ins and outs of language and how using language one can change the world. Sorry, didn't mean to blow your cover, but they were going to find out anyway.
I was going to say cover blown. I'm sorry.
It's okay. So, so here you have this school that I usually refer to as the assembly forming in the city of Uruk. The participants of it were all masters of the word, which means that their level of linguistic abstraction was very, very high. They could do magic with language. And they were all bound by oath to something called Nanam Dulam. And that's an interesting word because it's not a god in the sense of the priest kings like Enki or Inanna or Erishkigal or any of those people. And it's not an abstract concept, or it's not an object or a place like the Abzu. The Abzu is the chaotic void of Sumerian mythology. It is a phrase that means the real, the true. We don't have a good English word to it. In Arabic, it's al-haq. In Sanskrit, it's satya. And it means something bigger than just true. It's like the truly real, the only reality. And the assembly had a symbol, a seal, which was called Izig Ashkrush. That literally translates as house, walls, six, honey, which is the way you said beehive. So the seal of this group was the beehive. Are you following me so far? By the way, hi, Brian. Glad to see you here. Any questions before I go on? Yes, we like bees. Bees are very, very important, both as a symbol of transformation and as the one thing that allows us to all have food.
Dave asks,
yes,
where did Enki get the May?
That's a good question. He may have created them himself. Enki he's like the equivalent to the Egyptian Thoth, in that he was the scientist god, as well as being something of a trickster. So he was almost a Promethean figure in the sense of giving fire to man and that sort of stuff. So yes, and the cells that the bees put their honey in are hexagonal. and considered a perfect natural structure. So the Sumerians are going to look at that and go, "Oh, look, 6. It is the spiritual number."
So Nancy has a question that's a bit of a look back to what we started talking about. And she asks, she's referring to the disaster not according to plan, and she asks, how could the human race have avoided discovering agriculture?
There are lots of groups that still haven't discovered agriculture. Not as many as there used to be, because those of us who did discover agriculture mostly killed them off, murdered them, stole their land. And this is not just any agriculture. This is a particular kind of agriculture. This is industrial agriculture, the agricultural revolution, where we stopped eating large amounts of large varieties of food and went to a monoculture of eating. In the Middle East, you had wheat and barley, rye when you got further north. But we didn't need to discover agriculture. It was just something that happened. And go ahead.
I was just going to say, Nancy adds possibly grain agriculture, easier to steal, which is a good point.
Yes, grain agriculture. Grain is easy to steal. And all of the things that build up around that are easier to steal. I mean, look at the concept of gold as a valuable thing, for instance. Europe and the Middle East and China were all insane for gold. Native America, they knew what gold was. It was pretty. It was yellow. You could make things out of it. They couldn't care one way or another whether they had it or not.
Dave says grain is also easier to store, which is, yeah, I mean, that's how you create surplus and
and Aaron
things.
Wisely points out that gold has 0 survival value. Gold doesn't even really become useful for anything other than ornaments until you get into electronics. Gold is a phenomenally good conductor of heat and electricity, and it's inert, so you can use it in surgery. But it's also incredibly soft and malleable, and you can't eat it. I'm always laughing at the survivalists who are stockpiling gold for when the world comes to an end, because they're going to go out and go, "Oh, can I trade this gold for your food?" And anybody smart is going to go, "No, go eat the gold."
I don't know. They make a lot of gold food today.
Yes, but that's
it's pretty extravagant.
Yeah, it's definitely extravagant. So here you have this group of people who are working in the Middle East, starting in what is now Iraq, and for a very, very long time, quietly working to how would you say, to help those who would like to step across the river from unconscious humanity to conscious humanity, and perfecting their skills in doing that. And, probably some other stuff that's a little bit more shady, but we don't need to go into that right now. There's a reason why within the tradition, staying out of politics is a mandate. Because there are, if you were a master of the word, it would be incredibly easy for you to manipulate other human beings. Seriously. So, for a very long time, this is going on. Political boundaries change. One group rules, another group rules. The Sumerians are pushed out by the Akkadians, but and that's an interesting time because some of the Sumerians were absorbed into Akkadian culture. Excuse me, but some of them also left and went north, and probably east, north and east. And we'll come back to that group later. So here's the Akkadians. They adopt Sumerian religion. They basically, they're the Babylonians. They are all of the next group, the Semitic-speaking people who are living in the same place as the Sumerians were. Then you have the Persians moving in. And during this time, as the Persians move in, they have this dualistic religion around based around the Magi. We all know Zoroaster, and he was one of the prophets of that particular group, or the teachers. There's Sean. Hello, Sean. And I see that Sean is sitting in the bitter end again. I know that ceiling. So now, at the same time, the people who have been involved in this tradition have been spreading out around the world, around the known world and the unknown world for the most part. So the Magi, some of the Magi get brought into this tradition. Now, right now is towards the end of Old Kingdom Egypt, and the Persians invade Egypt. I think it was Cyrus and his son Cambyses who were doing the invading. And this gets us to a part of the tradition that is a little bit myth and a little bit fact. Because there is this fellow by the name of Pythagoras of Samos. He's half Greek, half Phoenician. Pull up, I made some notes on him. He was born about 569 BC in Samos, which is in Ionia, which is part of Greeks. His two main teachers, well, growing up, his father was a merchant, and he got to travel with his father a lot. And everywhere he traveled, his father arranged for him to study with the smartest people he could find. So it's said that he studied with the Chaldeans, which is the Phoenicians, and the Babylonians, and various folks like that. Before I get into him, there's another important figure that came out of Mesopotamia, which is Abraham. Y'all know who Abraham was, right? You find him in Genesis. So you remember, where did Abraham live? Yes, Ibrahim. Where did he live before he split off into the wilderness? Yes, he lived in Iraq. Do you know where exactly in Iraq? Yes, in Sumeria. He lived in a particular city. Who can name the city that Abraham split from? Yes. Abraham was born and raised in the city of Ur. He was part of the Semitic migrants that were moving into the area. According to the tradition, he was trained in the tradition of the assembly and then took that teaching out into the wilderness with him. And as you know, he founded an entire people and, well, 2 entire peoples and 3 religions, right? The Jews and the Arabs are both children of Abraham. And Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all come through him. So he's kind of important when it comes to world history. Yes, very powerful, May. So also, it was during this time that this was the time of the Jewish captivity. For those of you who know your biblical history, the Babylonians basically were taking over turf heading towards Egypt. And when they conquered Palestine, they took all of the most educated members of the Jewish populace and took them back to Babylon with them. And it wasn't a captivity like Moses and the Israelites in Egypt. The Babylonian Jews were trained as physicians and teachers and philosophers and mathematicians. They were very high caste, which is interesting. And I personally suspect that the Kabbalah originated there rather than anywhere else. So anyway, back to Pythagoras. So his father came from Tyre, which was one of the Phoenician city-states. His mother came from Samos, and he traveled around. Spent a lot of time in Syria, a lot of time in Chaldea, or Chaldea. And he had 2 very, very famous Greek teachers. One was named Thales, and the other was named Anaximander. They were mathematicians, philosophers, and it was Thales who sent him to Egypt. Said, you want to really learn math, you go to Egypt, because the Egyptians know their arithmetic and their geometry. So Pythagoras takes off to Egypt, and he is studying like crazy there. When the Persians show up and go, oh, we've conquered you, and they grab him and take him back to Babylon. Now, they don't hurt him. They don't throw him in prison or anything like that, because he is the son of a very important Phoenician merchant. And the Phoenicians were very, very important allies to the Persians at that time. So I have the quote here, and I'm going to pull it up and read it to you. In the Life of Pythagoras by Emballachus, he says, Pythagoras was transported by the followers of Cambyses as a prisoner of war. Whilst he was there, he gladly associated with the Magi and was instructed in their sacred rites and learnt a very mystical worship of the gods. He also reached the acme of perfection in arithmetic and music and other mathematical sciences taught by the Babylonians. It was probably at this point that the tradition that we're talking about was first referred to as Sarmun. Sarmun is a Persian word, a word in Old Persian, which supposedly means bee. I don't speak Old Persian, but I'm I'm taking people at their word. And it was probably a play off of the earlier Sumerian Sharmuna. And so this is where the tradition begins being known again as the beekeepers, because that whole bee thing has been going on for a few thousand years now. So Pythagoras studies in Babylon for 5 years, and then he leaves. And it's not like, nobody paid his ransom or anything. He just learned what he wanted and he took off, and everybody was happy with that. So he goes to Samos and he founds a school. The school that he founded was known as the Semicircle. Now, I should mention here that in this tradition, since the beginning, there was absolute equality between the sexes. And this is an important thing, because if you do not find equality between the genders, it's not part of the tradition. So bear that in mind. No equality, no tradition. Now, Pythagoras kept that part of the tradition quite strongly. So his students were both men and women. There were 2 layers of them. There was an outer school, which were called acousmatics. And they lived in towns and held down jobs and would come to the school for instruction. And they would be instructed usually not by Pythagoras himself, but by his students, his inner students. His inner students were called the mathematikoi. And they were an almost religious order. And they took a 5-part vow, or a 5-part affirmation. And it goes like this. At the deepest level of reality, at its deepest level, reality is mathematical in nature. Philosophy can be used for spiritual purification. The soul can raise up to union with the divine. Certain symbols have a mystical significance. And last, that all members of the order should observe strict loyalty and secrecy. Now, Pythagoras is important for a couple of reasons, and we can know that he's part of the tradition because he is the first guy to publicly or semi-publicly teach the Enneagram. Pythagoras, he didn't call it the Enneagram. The symbol that he used was a series of dots that form a triangle. And it was called the tetractys. And I went into that a little bit in the Ultimate Enneagram course, and I will go into it in depth at another point. But everything that can be plotted on today's Enneagram could be plotted in the exact same way on the tetractys if you knew how to use it. It was harder to learn how to use. Everything was much more secret. But Pythagoras was teaching to his students the use of the Enneagramma process 2,500 years ago. And so his school was destroyed. When was his school destroyed? About 508 BC. So 500 years before the Common Era. And his students kind of scattered. Now, some of his students ended up in places like Macedon, Greece, and most importantly, Egypt. This is where the last Egyptian dynasty was the Ptolemies. So we talk about Ptolemaic Egypt, and this is Ptolemy was one of the generals of Alexander the Psychopath, which is also known as Alexander the Great for some reason. I don't know why we assume that greatness and psychopathy go together, but we tend to at a time. But Ptolemy was given Egypt and built the city of Alexandria, and was, as far as we can tell, very heavily influenced by the tradition. He and his family go from him to 500 years worth of rule to Cleopatra the Fourth, I think she was, who was the last queen of Egypt before the Romans completely messed everything up, had dedicated their lives to turning Egypt into even more of a place of learning. The library, for those of you who don't know, was a collection of books from all over the known world in every language, that all of which were translated into Greek. So they would bring people who could speak both Greek and the language and read the language of the books and translate them. This library was filled with the knowledge of humanity. And they had things for everywhere from India, China, anywhere where there were people who could write books, they had books from there, all collected in one place. And they had the Museon. This is where we get our word museum. But it wasn't a collection of old dead stuff. The Museon was an academy that people could apply to if they were scientists, artists, whatever. And if they came there with a good enough project, the Ptolemies would support them in their research. And on top of that, you have some pretty profound spiritual stuff going on. And we know that there was a strong Pythagorean influence in Egypt at the time, especially in Lower Egypt, especially towards the coasts.
Dave has a question.
Yes, Dave has a question. It's a good question. Yes. All of these are fourth way schools. Everything that I've been talking about is a fourth way school, because it comes, it does its work, and then it fades into the background. And as the story goes on, this becomes more and more important. So the Pythagoras' semicircle was very important at the time, and it did things that changed the world. We have incredibly important mathematicians and philosophers who have come out of that school and were around for 500 years. I mean, you all know who Hypatia of Alexandria was? She was a Pythagorean, a philosopher, a mathematician, a scientist. And she was like one of the last of the great teachers in Alexandria. She was murdered by a mob at the behest of Cyril, who was bishop of Alexandria, for the crime of being intelligent and thinking for herself and being a woman. Because this was when the worst kind of Christianity was trying to take over the world.
Nancy says, the Museon should exist now if people wanted it to make it happen. It could exist now.
Yeah, it could exist now. but we don't have philosopher kings like the Ptolemies anymore.
Mm.
Yeah, the question is, where would it exist? Sweden, maybe? It might exist there. Its equivalent existed in what were in Europe the Dark Ages or the early Middle Ages. You had the equivalent of that in the Arab world. That was the Arab Golden Age, where from Baghdad all across North Africa, you had all of these incredibly well-trained scientists in all of the different disciplines creating the foundations of modern science. But you have to have a support system. Maybe we could find a philosopher CEO. Maybe we could. It would be better to become a philosopher CEO.
Mm.
Sean, make billions of dollars. Start a museum. So here's the thing, guys. What we're doing right now, this small little thing, your daughter is probably right. I'm not sure what you mean by the House of Wisdom. Do you mean the House of Strength, the Zurkhane, where they use the clubs and everything? God, I just noticed the time. I got to talk faster because I'm not done yet. Can you guys all hang out for a little bit more? Okay, good.
I'm getting a bunch of yeses. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just scrolling through my notes to see what's most important to talk about. Pythagoras was also very, very instrumental in creating the ray of creation, which we know about and have been talking about in the other group. Yeah, here's an interesting thought. Cleopatra, who was the last Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt, and who was a person who has really gotten a bad rap in the press, was probably an inductee into the assembly, and was probably what we would call Mugasham, a master of the word, which is why she was able to use her skills to control Julius Caesar and Mark Antony and protect Egypt for 20 years. I mean, the Roman, if it had not been for her interventions with the Romans, Egypt would have been taken over 25 years earlier. It would have been just snatched up and absorbed into the Roman machine when Caesar and Pompey were fighting. So Cleopatra was much cooler than people realize. Now, what comes next is Christianity. The birth of Jesus, upon whom be peace, was just a few years after this. And that set up some really interesting changes. We don't know that there was any kind of direct connection between Jesus and the assembly, though we can hypothesize because he spent a lot of time in Egypt. He spent most of his life in Egypt. during a time when the tradition was still alive. So who knows what he might have learned there. But anyway, he carries out his prophetic mandate, and you get, for a while, yeah, Aaron obviously knows his history. Yes, I understood that, but probably most people didn't. Yeah. Yeah, Cleopatra's little brother would have just handed Egypt over to the Romans and become a puppet king. So one thing we know is that there is a little bit of the tradition that sneaks in Matthew when they talk about the in America we call them the three kings or the three wise men. They were not kings. They were never kings according to the oldest text. They were magi. They were anywhere from 3 to 12 magi who came from Persia, because all of the signs and portents said something important is happening over here. And they used their astrology to figure out where and when, and showed up there, and you get the whole, we three kings of Orient are, et cetera, et cetera. You have all of Christianity happening. The most interesting stuff of post-Jesus was the Johnnian community in Ephesus, which they did not follow Paul, and the Thomason community in India. Thomas, the brother of Jesus, split eastward and ended up in India and founded a church there, which is still in existence. We have no guesses. We just have the traditions. There are traditional names for the Magi, Gasper and Malachor and all of that. But who knows? But what we do have, and this is interesting to me, so 600 years after Jesus, when what he taught had been turned into a state religion and or basically used to exert political control over the people, and everybody forgetting about what his teachings were, this young magi from probably Isfahan, but we don't know for sure, but likely Isfahan, that's my guess, starts trekking through the Middle East because he has heard that something is going to be happening, and he's in search of wisdom. And he trains with various holy men on the way, and eventually ends up in Arabia, in the city of Medina, right about the time that the Prophet Muhammad shows up there, and he becomes one of his companions. And we find this interesting because this is a highly educated man who was almost undoubtedly trained in the traditions of the assembly. He was instrumental in the lineage of certain Sufi orders. And if it wasn't for him, there might not be an Islam, because he was the guy who came up with a strategy that flustered a Meccan army that was like 10 times the size of the Medina army. We don't learn about these things in school here, but there was a famous battle called the Battle of the Ditch, the Khandak in Arabic, and any Arabic-speaking people here can correct my pronunciation, feel free. But basically what happened is all the Meccans decided that they were fed up with having this prophet here who was making them look bad. And so they go galumphing up on their horses and camels to Medina to basically stomp on him and destroy his entire movement. So Solomon, looking at the terrain and everything, says, you know, in Persia, when we have to deal with this many people who want to come over and stomp us, we dig a giant ditch around the city that they can't get over. And so the prophet, being the prophet, went, okay, guys, build a ditch. And they did. And the Meccans rode up to the ditch and went, oh, damn, we don't know how to deal with this. And so they lost a battle that they should have won. And it was a rout. It was a defeat because they did not know how to do that kind of fighting. And so thanks to Salman Farsi, the prophet lived, his religion lived, and we have an ongoing tradition. So now, Salman was a close companion of the prophet, and afterwards he left his. He supported both Abu Bakr and Ali in their caliphate. And then, like I said, he was instrumental in forming various Sufi orders, not the least of which was the one that gave all of the teachings about this stuff to me. So, that kind of brings us up to where we left off, or where we started last week with the history. Because there's like 6 generations of teachers between, not even that, 5 generations of teachers between Salman Farsi and Yusuf Hamedani. You know, Sean, there's not a whole lot of rivers in the area of Arabia. So bridge building, no. And there's not a lot of material to build bridges with. So yeah, Meccan's siege warfare was pretty much not known by the Arabs of Arabia. You know, and it was a trick that would not have worked anywhere else, interestingly enough. So there you have, from Inanna, Queen of Uruk, to Salman Farsi, the companion of the prophet, a brief history of the tradition, or a brief mythology of the tradition. Because nothing that I talked to you about here, with the possible exception of the Pythagorean stuff, I can demonstrate any proof for. So we have to take it as myth and legend rather than history. Pythagoras was pretty well documented, though the ability to use the tetrachus as an enneagram was not generally known from his public writings. That was part of the oral tradition. So, any questions? Any thoughts?
Fun material. That's how I feel.
Fun material.
I have a question.
Yes. Yes, please.
You mentioned that Pythagoras has used the tetrachus as the process enneagram.
Yes.
Is this documented? Is this, I mean, in any of the books? How
It's
similar?
not in the books that survive the Dark Ages. It was handed down in the oral tradition. I mean, I can sit down and show you exactly how it was done. It's not even hard, but if you don't know the key to doing it, you can't see it. But it's more oral tradition than any surviving writings.
Okay, is there any way that you can show us that how it works?
Yes, though I can't do it right now because I have to make a bunch of drawings.
Sure. Okay.
But when I do the 10-week Enneagram course, that will be part of the first week of it. We'll talk about that kind of stuff.
This is gonna be fantastic.
Yeah. Okay, Rena had a question there. How did this come together? I mean, from the start until now. To answer that question, I have to say that it is semi-mystical, in that it is my personal opinion that this material is not allowed to disappear from the earth. As much as people try and wipe it out. And trust me on this, people have been trying to wipe out this material since it emerged, because it is completely antithetical to domestication. This material turns you from a domesticated primate into an adult human being. And trust me on this, the Insani Kamo is terrifying to the power structure of the world. Insani Kamo means the perfected human being, the awakened person. There is nothing more frightening to the kings and potentates of the world than the awakened man or the awakened woman. Yes, Ibn al-Arabi was a great example of that. Mansur al-Hallaj is an even better example of that, because they managed to kill him. So the tradition continues, and it's handed down, and there's nothing like super duper mystical hidden masters kind of stuff. It's people who Aaron is correct. The bits and pieces pop up in history all the time. If you look at your history and you know what you're looking for, you'll see it over and over again. You'll see the hand of this tradition laid gently upon the world. Vivian, no, that it is not. At the end of January, I'm starting a 10-week course on that's going to be based around what people call the Enneagram of personality. Only I'm going to teach it in the way that it was meant to be taught before the Catholics got hold of it and did all that weird shit to it. Yeah, it should be a lot of fun. Yeah. And it's going to be taught in a private forum, not on this, because I don't want to happen last night. I don't want to happen what happened last night, where the room gets full and people who really want to be in here can't get in here. That was like, I took that personally. So we're not going to be having that. As a matter of fact, even this is going to be switching over to a new platform as soon as I can get it set up. So I can assure that people who want to be here can be here. And I can assure that everybody gets a voice, because, I mean, I could do this through, you know, just YouTube broadcasting, and it would be me again sitting here talking to a screen rather than being able to dialogue with you. And I think that the ability to carry on a dialogue in real time is really important.
Mm. Vivian asks if we are going to use Zoom. How are you feeling about that? Do you think you talked about Zoom?
Yeah, that's what I'm leaning towards right now. Zoom will allow me to have up to 100 people in a conference. Their recording software is very, very good, so I can make a record of it. And I think that that's the way to go. And there is Dave and his daughter. What's your daughter's name again?
Sophie.
Sophie.
Yeah.
Hi.
She has heard some of tonight, and that is interesting.
So, Sophie, do you know what your name means?
Wisdom?
Yes. That's exactly what it means. It's like one of the better names you can ever have.
What do you think about that, sir?
Good.
Good. Yeah.
So are you making sure that your dad gets plenty of your wisdom?
She is. She definitely is.
Yeah. So, yeah, we're probably going to use Zoom because I can do everything on that I can do on this and more. And that's a good question. And the answer seems to be not really. I know that Gurdjieff spent a fair bit of time in Tibet. And so he was probably influenced from there. And, you know, who knows how far the traditions have gotten out. I know that they got to India. And so likely up into Tibet, Afghanistan, places like that.
So that was Ahmed asking any influences from the Far East on this tradition. So that was the answer to that question.
And Aaron asked, where does Khidr insert into the narrative of the tradition? We do not hear much about him before Moses as that name. And the question is, do you think Mr. G was a Muslim? I think that he practiced Islam at various different times in his life. He self-identified as Christian, so I take him at his word. But I know that he knew how to do salat, and when he was in Muslim groups, he would do it. I'm pretty sure that he understood that it was all pointing at the same thing.
Nancy asks, are there places in the world where you see the tradition being active now?
Yes.
Would you be willing to name them?
Right where you're sitting now. This is a temporary autonomous zone created by the tradition, through the tradition, using its least capable and most incompetent servant.
Will you be willing to do like a retreat where you can teach us firsthand?
I have that on my list of things to do, as a matter of fact. I have to figure out where would be the best place to do it. Someplace where you know, you have a lot of privacy, and yet it's a nice place to be. So I'm thinking perhaps Spain, because, you know, Andalusia. You know, I would love to do a retreat right in Ibn al-Arabi's backyard.
That would be lovely.
Yes.
Yes.
Ahmed's excited about that prospect too.
Yeah, and that's just a hop, skip, and a jump for you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's right. I have one student right now who is working on moving to Spain.
Oh, wow.
Either to Barcelona or to Valencia. I don't think they're sure yet where they're going to land, or down in Andalusia. So I will use him as my front man to get out there and find the right place. Do a 2-week retreat in on the warm, sunny beaches of the Mediterranean.
Sean's curious to know if we have a time frame for the retreat.
Next year, sometime in 2019. I ain't getting any younger. I got to hurry up on this shit. You know. So, I have things to do, people to teach. So start saving up your nickels and dimes, Sean, because I expect you to be there. Bring your sword, because I need somebody to fence with.
I don't know if you can bring your sword on an airplane, but you can try.
All right, Aaron, take care. Yes, you actually can, especially if it's only a training sword.
Yeah, that's true. Baggage check.
Yes, a tip as well. And it is getting later. We have ran very, very late on this one. And so I should probably bid you all good night. I know that some of you have to go off and make salat, because the sun is going to be rising any minute now over the Nile. So thank you all for coming. And we will be talking to you all again soon.
Yep. It's always good to see you all.
Yes, makes my week. So you want to hang out for a second after Kyle, and we can debrief?
Yes, let's do that. So I guess I will not be here next week. I am visiting grandparents. However, you will have your normal, usually scheduled sessions with Mishtan.
Yeah, it just won't be nearly as good.
I know. You'll get by. You'll get by without
but barely, me. Only barely. There will be tears. There will be sadness.
Well, I'll be back the week after that. No worries.
Yes.
Yes. Merry Christmas to all of you who celebrate. Thank you. And Happy New Year as well.
So, good night, farewell, so long, adios, adieu. God, it sounds like a song from. All right, so I'm going to. I'm also going to